There is an exhaustion unique to those who love God sincerely. Not the exhaustion of indifference or rebellion, but the exhaustion of trying too hard, striving too long, carrying the impossible weight of attempting to make yourself worthy through sheer force of will and relentless self-improvement. If you have ever felt this exhaustion, you know what it is. You know the feeling of waking up and immediately reviewing yesterday's failures. The way a moment of impatience or selfishness can unravel an entire day of spiritual effort. The quiet despair that settles in when you realize again that you fell short of the person you are trying to become. The nagging suspicion that no matter how much you pray, how carefully you examine your conscience, how diligently you pursue virtue, you are still fundamentally the same person who needed changing years ago. This is the suffering of the person fighting for perfection. And it is a suffering that most spiritual books quietly encourage by presenting holiness as an achievement, virtue as a conquest, sainthood as the reward of sufficient effort applied over sufficient time. But Saint Thérèse of Lisieux discovered something that shattered this entire framework. Not gradually, not through years of accumulated wisdom, but through a single luminous insight that she describes as the discovery of her entire vocation. She discovered that the path to holiness is not a ladder to be climbed through effort, but an elevator that lifts the weak, the small, and the imperfect into the arms of God, precisely because of their weakness, their smallness, their imperfection. Let me ask you something gently. What if everything you believe about how holiness works is wrong? What if the striving itself is the problem? What if God is not waiting for you to become better before He fully embraces you, but is instead waiting for you to stop trying to be better so that He can make you so? This is the radical power of spiritual childhood. And it begins with a story. There is a moment in Thérèse's life that she considered one of the most important revelations she ever received. Not a mystical vision, not a dramatic locution, but a quiet discovery made in a monastery garden during an ordinary conversation with an older sister about a staircase she could not climb. Thérèse was struggling, not with any particular sin or crisis, but with a problem that had plagued her spiritual life since childhood. She wanted to reach the heights of holiness, felt the desire for it burning in her heart with real intensity, yet could see clearly that her own weakness prevented her from climbing toward it. Every time she tried to ascend through effort, through penance, through the accumulation of virtues, she would fall again, not into serious sin, but into the small failures that revealed how little she had actually changed. A flash of irritation, a moment of self-pity, a preference for her own comfort that contradicted the total self-gift she desired to make. She was, in her own words, a child too small to climb the staircase of perfection, and no amount of effort seemed able to make her taller. One day, while reflecting on this, she saw a child attempting to climb the stairs in her family home. The child kept lifting its small foot to the first step, only to fall back down. Lifted again, fell again. The staircase was simply too tall for legs that small. The child could try 1,000 times with complete sincerity and still never reach the top floor through its own effort. But then the mother came, and in an instant the problem was solved, not because the child suddenly grew strong enough to climb, but because the mother bent down, gathered the child in her arms and carried it to the top. The child contributed nothing except its lifted arms and its willingness to be held. In this simple image, Thérèse saw her entire spiritual life transformed. She was the child. The staircase was perfection. And God, like the mother who bends down to gather the helpless child, was not waiting for her to climb, but waiting for her to stop trying, so He could carry her. This was not a vision of passivity. It was a vision of a completely different kind of effort. Not the effort of climbing, but the effort of lifting your arms. Not the effort of achieving, but the effort of trusting. Not the effort of becoming worthy, but the effort of remaining small enough to be lifted. She wrote afterward that this discovery filled her with such joy that she could barely contain it, because it meant that her weakness was not a barrier to holiness, but the very condition that made God's mercy necessary and therefore most fully operative in her life. It meant that every fall, every failure, every moment of discovering anew how small she was not a defeat but an invitation to lift her arms, to trust, to let herself be carried rather than exhausting herself trying to climb. This is the story that changes everything about how holiness works, and it is the key to understanding why spiritual childhood is not a spiritual strategy for the weak, but the most radical form of trust available to any soul, regardless of how far they have come or how far they still have to go. Most people assume that spiritual childhood is Thérèse's way of saying, settle for less. Be content with immaturity. Stop striving because striving is too hard. But this is the exact opposite of what she meant. Spiritual childhood is not the absence of desire for holiness. It is the presence of a desire so honest that it can finally admit the truth that ambitious spiritual programs spend years trying to avoid. You cannot get there by yourself. Not almost. Not with enough effort. Not if you just try harder or pray more or examine your conscience with greater precision. You cannot get there by yourself. And the moment you fully accept this, not as a temporary setback but as a permanent condition of your humanity, something extraordinary happens. The fight against yourself stops. The exhausting effort to manufacture virtue through willpower collapses. The anxious monitoring of your progress, the constant measuring of your growth, the desperate comparison of where you are with where you should be, all of it dissolves. Not into indifference, into trust. The trust of a child who has given up trying to climb because the Father is right there ready to carry. The trust of someone who finally understands that the arms they need are not their own. Have you ever tried to do something you fundamentally cannot do? Kept throwing yourself at it with increasing desperation? Felt the particular humiliation of effort that produces no results, the frustration of sincerely trying and repeatedly failing? This is what striving for perfection through willpower feels like, and it is not nobility. It is the soul refusing to acknowledge its own poverty, refusing to admit that what it needs is beyond what it can generate, refusing to become small enough to receive what can only be given, never earned. Thérèse refused this refusal. She chose to be small, chose to acknowledge her poverty, chose to stop fighting for perfection and start trusting the one for whom perfecting her was not a burden but a delight. And the relief this brought her was not the relief of giving up. It was the relief of putting down a weight you were never supposed to carry in the first place. The relief of discovering that the burden you have been laboring under for years is unnecessary, not because the destination is not real, but because you were never meant to reach it under your own power. This is the first revelation of spiritual childhood. Your weakness is not an obstacle to holiness. It is the very place where holiness begins. Because weakness creates space for God to act. It creates the need for mercy, the necessity of grace, the requirement of trust. And in that need, that necessity, that requirement, God moves into your life not as an occasional helper, but as the primary agent of your transformation. But here is where spiritual childhood becomes truly radical. It is not just about accepting weakness as a theological principle. It is about changing how you respond to failure. And this is where most people, even those who intellectually embrace the idea of spiritual childhood, struggle most. When you fail, when you fall back into the same sin you confessed last week, when you are impatient with the person you promised yourself you would be patient with, when you choose your own comfort over charity for the 100th time, what do? Most people do one of two things. They despair, or they double down. They either sink into self-condemnation, telling themselves that they are hopeless, that God must be tired of their repeated failures, that they are too broken to ever actually change, or they tighten their grip, increase their spiritual discipline, create stricter systems of self-monitoring, in a determined attempt to force themselves into virtue through sheer resolution. Both responses are wrong. Both keep the soul trapped in the economy of self-reliance, where the measure of your spiritual life is your performance. Thérèse's response to failure was something entirely different, something that shocked her contemporaries, that still shocks modern readers, that sounds almost irresponsible until you understand the depth of trust behind it. She got up immediately, without drama, without extended self-examination, without the long rehearsal of self-accusation that most devout people mistake for humility. She would fall, acknowledge it briefly, and immediately turn back to God with something approaching lightness. not because the failure did not matter, but because she had learned something most people never discover, that prolonged self-reproach is not humility, it is pride. It is the soul refusing to accept that God's mercy is bigger than its failure, that His forgiveness is real and immediate, that the right response to falling is not to lie in the dirt reviewing your failure, but to get up and run back to the one who forgives. Have you ever noticed that the people who dwell most extensively on their failures are often also the people who have the highest opinion of themselves? That extended self-condemnation sometimes contains hidden pride, the pride that cannot believe it fell, that expected better of itself, that is more shocked by its weakness than God is. Thérèse understood this. She wrote that when she fell, she would say to God something like, "You see what I am, Lord. If you do not help me, I will always be like this." Not excessive lamentation, not dramatic self-accusation, simply honest acknowledgement of poverty combined with immediate return to trust. This is the second revelation of spiritual childhood. The proper response to failure is not extended suffering over your failure, but immediate return to God, not because the failure does not matter. It does. Not because you should not be sorry. You should. But because the most important thing you can do after falling is get up, quickly, without the luxury of long self-pity, and let God be the one to deal with what you cannot fix about yourself. Because here is the truth that spiritual childhood rests on. God is not surprised by your failures. He knew when He called you into relationship with Him exactly what you were, exactly how you would fall, how often you would repeat the same mistakes, how slow your transformation would be. And He called you anyway, not despite this knowledge but with full possession of it. He is not disappointed the way your idealistic version of yourself is disappointed. He does not review your failures with the exhausted frustration you review them with. He is not waiting for you to finally get your act together before He fully loves you. He loves you now. In this failure, in this repeated pattern, in this gap between who you are and who you desperately want to be. And His love is not merely tolerant of your weakness, it is actively, purposefully using it to draw you deeper into dependence on Him, deeper into the trust that only poverty of spirit can produce. This is the scandal of spiritual childhood. It suggests that your failures are not simply unfortunate interruptions in your journey toward holiness, but materials God is using to build the very thing you are seeking. That your weakness is not a bug in the spiritual life, but a feature. That every time you fall and feel small, you are being positioned exactly where grace can reach you most effectively. Most people cannot accept this. It seems too convenient, too permissive, too likely to lead to spiritual mediocrity. They worry that if they stop fighting for perfection, they will simply stop growing. That if they embrace weakness rather than warring against it, they will settle into comfortable sin. That if they put down the exhausting weight of striving, they will become spiritually lazy. But this is not what happens. What happens is this. When you release the burden of self-made holiness, when you stop managing your spiritual progress and trust it entirely to God, when you become genuinely small enough to need constant help, you become more attentive to grace, not less, more dependent on prayer, not less, more honest about your need for God's intervention in your daily life, not less. Because spiritual childhood does not remove desire for holiness, it purifies it. It transforms the desire from a self-improvement project where you are the central agent working toward your own perfection into a relationship where God is the primary agent working in and through and despite your weakness to bring about what neither you nor anyone else could produce on their own. Have you ever experienced this transformation? The shift from striving to receiving, from managing your spiritual life to surrendering it, from fighting for perfection to trusting the one who perfects. It begins with a decision, not a dramatic resolution, not a new spiritual program, just the small daily radical decision to put down the weight you are carrying and lift your arms instead, to stop trying to climb the staircase and let yourself be carried. This decision will need to be made again tomorrow and the day after. Because the habits of striving are deep, the desire to control your spiritual progress is powerful, and the culture surrounding you rewards effort and achievement even in the spiritual life. But each time you make it, each time you catch yourself fighting for perfection, and choose instead the radical trust of spiritual childhood, something shifts. The soul lightens. The anxiety loosens its grip. The exhausting project of self-made holiness loses its plausibility, and in its place something quietly miraculous begins to grow. Genuine transformation, the kind that only God can produce, in the small, imperfect, completely surrendered soul that finally stopped trying to climb and allowed itself to be carried all the way home. Before continuing, it is worth pausing to let the weight of what Thérèse discovered settle, because the implications of spiritual childhood do not stay neatly inside the boundaries of personal prayer. They extend outward into every dimension of your life, reshaping how you work, how you rest, how you relate, how you fail, how you persist. The person who has truly embraced being small before God cannot remain unchanged in how they move through the world. The child who has stopped fighting the staircase begins to walk differently through the whole house. There is a dimension of spiritual childhood that most reflections on Thérèse's little way overlook, and it is perhaps the most practically transformative dimension of all. It is the question of how you relate to other people's spiritual journeys, how you respond to those who seem more advanced, more virtuous, more naturally gifted in the life of prayer and virtue than you feel yourself to be. This is where spiritual childhood meets jealousy, comparison, and the quiet bitterness that can fester in a devout soul that is genuinely trying but feels perpetually behind, perpetually insufficient, perpetually watching other people apparently thrive where they struggle. Let me ask you something from the heart. Do you compare your interior life to other people's? Do you look at certain people in your parish, your community, your religious tradition, and feel a mixture of admiration and discouragement? Do you wonder why they seem to have what you are fighting so hard for, peace, charity, consistency in virtue, while you keep falling into the same failures, struggling with the same weaknesses, making the same insufficient progress? This comparison is one of the most effective weapons in the arsenal of the enemy of the spiritual life, because it takes your eyes off God and fixes them on other people. It makes holiness a competition rather than a relationship. It transforms the spiritual life from a personal journey of love into a social performance measured against others' apparent progress. But here is what spiritual childhood does to comparison. Not eliminate it overnight. The tendency is too deep for that. But it provides a completely different framework for understanding it. Because in spiritual childhood, you are no longer trying to match anyone else's progress. You are not competing for God's attention, competing for grace, competing for the finite resources of a God who might run out of love for you if he is already loving someone else so abundantly. Thérèse wrestled with this. She looked at the great saints of the Church, the mystics, the reformers, the miracle workers, and felt the gap between their evident holiness and her own smallness acutely. She wanted what they had. She desired the depth they reached. And she could see that her own path was not leading her to the same dramatic heights. But instead of despairing, she asked a different question. Not, why can I not become what they became? But, what is God calling me to become given who I actually am? And in asking this question honestly, she discovered something that liberated her. That God does not desire the same holiness from every soul. He desires a unique holiness from each soul. A holiness shaped by that soul's particular capacities, particular wounds, particular place in the body of Christ. She wrote about this using the image of a garden. In a garden, God cultivates many kinds of flowers. Not all are roses. Some are humble daisies or violets, small and unimpressive compared to the grand roses that attract attention. But God does not look at the violet and wish it were a rose. He loves it as a violet. He cultivates it as a violet. He needs it to be the best violet it can be, not a poor imitation of something grander. This image is not resignation. It is liberation. Because it means that comparing your spiritual journey to someone else's is as meaningless as a violet comparing itself to a rose. They are not competing. They are not on the same path. They are both expressions of a beauty that requires both of them and all the other flowers in the garden to be complete. Have you ever let yourself believe that your specific smallness, the particular way you are limited, wounded, weak, might actually be part of what God desires from you rather than what He is waiting for you to overcome? that your particular flower might be exactly what the garden needs, rather than an inferior version of someone else's flower. This is what spiritual childhood opens up when you apply it to comparison. It does not just tell you to stop comparing. It gives you a reason that goes deeper than willpower. You are not the same kind of flower. Comparison is not just unhelpful, it is a category mistake. A violet cannot measure its spiritual progress against a rose because they are growing toward different expressions of the same beauty. And when you truly understand this, when you accept not just intellectually but emotionally in your gut and your heart that your smallness is not a deficiency but a specific gift to the body of Christ, comparison loses much of its sting. Not because you no longer notice others' apparent progress, but because their progress is no longer threatening to your sense of what God is doing in you. This is the third revelation of spiritual childhood. You are not called to be a better version of someone else. You are called to be the full version of yourself, your specific self, with your specific weakness, your specific wound, your specific smallness, fully surrendered to a God who made you this particular way and desires your particular holiness, not a holiness borrowed from someone else's pattern. The fight against perfection, properly understood, is ultimately a fight for authenticity, for the permission to be who you actually are before God, rather than performing a version of holiness you observed in someone else or read about in a spiritual classic, for the courage to trust that God can work with what you actually are, rather than what you think you should be. Thérèse understood this with uncommon clarity for someone so young. She never tried to become another Teresa of Avila, another Catherine of Siena, another Mary Magdalene. She tried to become fully herself, the little Thérèse, the flower that God had specifically planted in the garden of his church, needing to bloom in the specific way she was made to bloom. And in becoming fully herself, in embracing spiritual childhood as the authentic expression of who she was before God, rather than a fallback position chosen because greater holiness was unavailable, she became one of the most universally beloved saints the Church has ever produced. Not despite her smallness, but through it. Not despite her little way, but because of it. Because people across every culture, every century, every spiritual background recognize themselves in her. They see their own smallness reflected in her story. They find in her permission to be small themselves, to be carried rather than to climb, to receive rather than achieve, to trust rather than fight. And in that recognition, they discover what she discovered, that the radical power of spiritual childhood is not the power of the weak pretending they are content with weakness. It is the power of the honest, who have finally admitted that they cannot carry themselves to God and have discovered that they do not have to, because He is already bending down, already reaching for them, already ready to gather them up and carry them home, just as He always was, just as He always will be. Waiting not for them to become perfect, but for them to become small enough to receive what only He can give. And that smallness, that honest, trusting, completely surrendered smallness, is not the failure of the spiritual life. It is its very heart. Stop fighting for perfection, not because perfection does not matter, but because the fight is not yours to win. God is the one who perfects. Your part is infinitely smaller and infinitely more important. To stop resisting the arms that are reaching for you, to acknowledge your poverty without shame, to lift your arms toward the one who is already bending down, to allow yourself to be carried, held, transformed by a love that was never waiting for you to climb but only waiting for you to be still, long enough to be lifted. This is what Thérèse learned on the floor of a monastery garden, watching a child and its mother, understanding in a flash of grace what years of striving had failed to teach her, that the smallest soul, fully surrendered, is already home, already held, already loved with a love that has nothing to do with perfection and everything to do with mercy. And mercy, unlike perfection, is already yours. It has always been yours. The only question is whether you are finally willing to receive it.